The winter of 1873 fell upon the Wyoming Territory like judgment from an unforgiving God. Snow buried the sins and secrets of Clearwater Valley beneath a blanket of pristine white, transforming the landscape into something almost holy. But nature's purity couldn't cleanse the prejudice and fear that festered in the hearts of those who claimed to tame this wilderness. This is the story of Eleanor Blackwood, a widow whose solitary existence at the edge of civilization was shattered when she made a choice that defied everything her community believed in, a choice that would forever alter the course of her life and challenge the very foundations of the world she knew. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eleanor Blackwood's cabin stood like a last outpost against the wilderness, perched at the farthest edge of Clearwater Valley where civilization surrendered to untamed forest. The structure itself seemed to bear the weight of her grief, weathered and unyielding, yet somehow vulnerable against the vastness that surrounded it. 3 years a widow, Eleanor had learned to wear her solitude like armor, finding a strange comfort in the predictable rhythm of survival. Dawn found her, as it always did, stoking embers in the hearth before her fingers had fully awakened from their night's stiffness. At 32, her face had begun to hold the weathered dignity of a woman who had faced the harshness of frontier life without surrendering to it. Her dark hair, once the pride of her youth back in Pennsylvania, now hung in a simple braid down. Her back peppered with strands of premature silver that she never bothered to notice. The cabin around her told the story of a life stripped to essentials. A bed tucked against the far wall, covered with quilts she'd stitched during those first lonely months after William's passing. A table made by his hands, now bearing the scratches and stains of meals eaten in silence. A rifle kept loaded above the door. 2 chairs at the table, though only one had felt the weight of a body for years now. Eleanor moved through her morning with mechanical precision. Feed the chickens, milk the cow, check the snare lines, split more firewood before the next storm. Her breath clouded before her as she worked, the air carrying that particular stillness that promised more snow by nightfall. The mountains loomed to the west, massive and indifferent to the tiny human figure moving through their shadow. The people of Clearwater settlement, such as they were, had long ago stopped trying to coax her back into their fold. They left her be, partly out of respect for her grief, partly out of discomfort with a woman who seemed to need so little from others. Occasionally, Reverend Miller's wife would appear with preserves or mending, clucking her tongue at Eleanor's unnatural solitude. The general store owner, Mr. Whitaker, would extend credit when her coin ran short, but his charity came wrapped in pity that stung worse than the bite of winter air. "A woman alone invites trouble," he'd say, pushing her purchases across the counter. "Your William wouldn't want you out there tempting Providence." But William was dead, his body buried on the hill behind their cabin, and Providence had already taken everything it could from Eleanor Blackwood. Or so she believed. The morning turned to afternoon, and Eleanor found herself checking and reinforcing the chicken coop. The night before, something had tried to get in. A fox, or perhaps a young mountain lion, driven to desperation by the deepening winter. Her fingers worked deftly with hammer and nails, her mind elsewhere. She was thinking about the letter that had arrived with the last supply wagon, still unopened on her mantel. From her sister in Boston, no doubt filled with more pleas for Eleanor. To come home to civilization before the wilderness claims what's left of you. But Boston had never been home. Home had been William, and now home was this place they had built together, this hard-won corner of creation that demanded everything, and promised nothing except the dignity of surviving on one's own terms. The first flakes of snow began to fall as the afternoon light waned. Eleanor secured the livestock and gathered more wood for the night. The wind had picked up, moaning through the pines that surrounded her property, a sound that once frightened her but now served as familiar company. She was heading toward them, in cabin, arms laden with split logs when she heard it. At first, she thought it was just the wind playing tricks, the way it sometimes mimicked human sounds to torment lonely souls. But then it came again, a low, guttural sound, halfway between a groan and a word. Eleanor froze, her body tensing with an instinct older than reason. The sound had come from the edge of the clearing, where the ordered world of her homestead dissolved into wilderness. She set down the firewood quietly, one hand moving to the knife at her belt. For a long moment she stood perfectly still, listening beyond the wind's keening. There it was again, definitely human. Caution warred with curiosity as Eleanor moved toward the tree line. The sensible thing, the safe thing, would be to retreat to the cabin, bar the door, and let the night decide the fate of whatever poor soul was out there. Clearwater Valley had its share of dangers, not all of them from nature. Bandits, drifters, and deserters from both sides of the recent war occasionally passed through, bringing trouble that outlasted their brief stays. And then there were the Shoshone, whose ancestral hunting grounds had been before the treaties pushed them further west. Relations had been mostly peaceful these last few years, but rumors of raids on outlying homesteads still circulated through the settlement like ghost stories, tales of vengeance and bloodshed that grew more elaborate with each telling. The falling. Snow had begun to obscure the ground. Eleanor's breath came in short, visible puffs as she approached the edge of her property. That's when she saw him. At first glance, he appeared to be nothing more than a dark shape against the whiteness, like a fallen branch partially covered in snow. But as she drew closer, the shape resolved into the unmistakable form of a man, or what remained of one. He lay sprawled against the base of a pine, one arm outstretched as if reaching for something beyond his grasp. Even in the fading light, Eleanor could see the dark stain spreading from his side, melting the snow beneath him. She approached cautiously, knife still in hand. The man didn't move. His face was turned away, but his long black hair and the fringed leather of his clothing told her what she needed to know. This was no settler or drifter. This was a Shoshone warrior, far from where his people were supposed to be. Eleanor stood over him, knife ready, thoughts racing. He appeared to be unconscious, perhaps already dead. Blood had soaked through his side, where what looked like a bullet wound had torn through him. His breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible, in the gathering twilight with snow collecting. On his still form, he was already being reclaimed by the winter. The smart decision was clear. Turn around, go back to the cabin, bar the door, let nature take its course. The man was dying anyway. Even if she could save him, what then? Harbor an injured Shoshone warrior? The people from the settlement would call it treason. They'd say she was aiding the enemy, endangering them all. Eleanor stood motionless, knife gripped tight, as snowflakes caught in her eyelashes and melted down her cheeks like tears she refused to shed. 3 winters ago, William had ridden out during a blizzard to help a neighboring homesteader whose barn had collapsed. He never returned. They found his body 2 days later, frozen where he'd fallen after his horse threw him. No one had been there to help him. No one had made the choice that might have saved him. The knife lowered to her side. Damn it all, she whispered to the uncaring wind. Getting him to the cabin nearly broke her. He was tall and solid despite his wounded state, dead weight that fought her every step of the way. Eleanor was strong from years of working the homestead alone, but this pushed her to her limits. By the time she dragged him across the threshold, her clothes were soaked with sweat and his blood, her muscles screaming in protest. She laid him before the hearth and built up the fire until its light filled the cabin with dancing shadows. Only then did she get her first clear look at the man whose life now rested in her hands. He couldn't have been much older than 30. His face bore the dignified features of his people. High cheekbones, a strong jaw now clenched in pain, and skin the color of the rich earth by the river. A jagged scar crossed his left cheek, old and long-healed. His clothing was a mixture of traditional Shoshone garments and items that might have been taken from settlers or their bodies. Eleanor worked methodically, cutting away the frozen layers to expose the wound in his side. The bullet had passed clean through, which was a mercy, but he'd lost too much blood, and the cold had sunk deep into him. She cleaned the wound with whiskey, precious commodity out here, but infection was a crueler killer than blood loss. Her fingers moved with the precision born of necessity. Frontier life had made her no stranger to treating injuries. As she worked, her mind ran ahead to consequences. If he lived through the night, what then? If he died, would his people come, looking for him? Would they blame her? Would the settlement blame her if they discovered she'd tried to help him? She pushed these thoughts aside. Right now, there was only this moment, this task, this life hanging by a thread that she held in her hands. When she finished bandaging his wound, Eleanor covered him with her thickest quilts. The color had not returned to his face, but his breathing seemed less labored. She stoked the fire once more, then settled into the chair beside him, rifle across her lap. Not pointed at him, but ready. She would sit vigil through the night, though whether as nurse or guard, she couldn't rightly say. As darkness claimed the valley and the storm howled its fury against her cabin walls, Eleanor Blackwood watched the face of the stranger she had saved, wondering if dawn would find him among the living or the dead, and which outcome she should pray for. Throughout that long night, as wind rattled the shutters and shadows danced across the cabin walls, Eleanor drifted between alertness and exhaustion. Sometimes she caught herself staring at the wounded man's face, searching for clues to who he might be beyond the simple label Shoshone that the settlement would place upon him. Had he been part of a raiding party, a scout, a lone hunter caught in the wrong place? The single eagle feather braided into his hair suggested status among his people. The beaded medicine pouch at his neck spoke of spiritual significance. Occasionally, he would stir and murmur words in a language she didn't understand, his forehead hot with fever. Each time, Eleanor would dampen a cloth and press it to his brow, wondering what dreams or memories haunted him. Once his hand shot out and gripped her wrist with surprising strength, his dark eyes flying open, but seeing nothing of the present. She didn't pull away, didn't speak, just waited until the moment passed, and his grip loosened as consciousness slipped from him again. By first light, Eleanor's practical nature had formulated a plan. She would nurse him until he could travel, then send him on his way with enough provisions to reach his people. A life for a life, payment of a debt the universe had placed upon her when William died alone in the snow. No one from the settlement need ever know. She would rewrite this encounter as nothing more than a strange dream shared between two souls during the heart of winter. Little did she know that fate and the people of Clearwater Valley had other plans. When morning finally broke, pale and tentative through the snow-laden clouds, Eleanor rose stiffly from her chair. Her back protested the night spent in vigil, but the Shoshone warrior still breathed, which seemed miracle enough. His fever had broken sometime in the pre-dawn hours. Now he slept the deep sleep of a body beginning its journey back from the brink. Eleanor stoked the fire and put coffee on to boil. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider the enormity of what she'd done and what lay ahead. She had brought an injured Shoshone warrior into her home in a valley where fear of native raids ran deep as the mountain roots. If discovered, the consequences would be swift and merciless for both of them. But as she moved about her morning tasks, casting occasional glances at the sleeping figure by her hearth, Eleanor Blackwood realized that something within her had shifted during the night. Like the frozen ground that eventually yields to spring's persistence, something long dormant had begun to thaw. It wasn't compassion exactly. She'd never lost that. It was something more fundamental, the recognition that in saving this stranger's Life, she had somehow reclaimed a piece of her own. For 3 days the warrior lingered between worlds, his consciousness surfacing briefly before sinking back into fevered dreams. Elena maintained her routine, adding to it the care of her unexpected guest. She changed his bandages twice daily, spooned broth between his lips when he could swallow, and kept the fire burning higher than she would have allowed for herself, alone. On the 4th morning, Eleanor was kneading dough for bread when she felt the weight of eyes upon her back. She turned slowly, hands still dusted with flour, to find him watching her. His gaze was clear now, dark and alert, assessing her with the careful calculation of one who has awakened in enemy territory. Neither spoke. The silence stretched between them, taut as a bowstring. Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron and moved deliberately to the stove, where she poured a cup of coffee. She approached him with measured steps and set the cup within his reach, not too close, not invading the space around him. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You understand me?" she asked, her voice rough from disuse. He didn't answer immediately, just continued to study her face, as if memorizing its contours. Then, with a slight nod that clearly cost him pain, he reached for the coffee. "Yes." The word emerged hoarse but unmistakable. English. Something shifted in Eleanor's chest. Relief, perhaps, that communication would be possible, or surprise that he'd admitted to understanding the language of those who had claimed his people's lands. "You've been shot," she said unnecessarily. "The wound is clean. No infection if you're lucky." He touched his bandaged side gingerly, his face betraying nothing of the pain she knew he must feel. "Why?" he asked. Eleanor understood the question beneath the question. Why had she helped him? Why hadn't she left him to die in the snow, or worse, summoned men from the settlement to finish what the bullet had started? She turned back to her bread dough, punching it down with more force than necessary. "You were dying. I couldn't leave. You there?" "Many would. I'm not many." He made a sound that might have been acknowledgement or skepticism. Eleanor didn't press for clarification. She finished shaping the dough and set it near the hearth to rise, acutely aware of his gaze, tracking her movements. "My name is Eleanor Blackwood," she offered, though she wasn't sure why. Names seemed suddenly important, a small bridge across, the vast divide between them. He hesitated, weighing something in his mind. "Joseph," he said finally. "Joseph Redhawk." The name surprised her. Part white, part Shoshone, like a man straddling 2 worlds and belonging fully to neither. She nodded, accepting the offering without comment. "You should rest," she said. "That bullet took a lot out of you." "Bullet took nothing. Man who shot me, he took." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "And what did he take?" "My horse. My rifle." Joseph's jaw tightened. "My brother's life." The admission hung in the air between them, weighted with implication. Eleanor's hand moved unconsciously to the rifle that still leaned against her chair. Was he a threat? A victim? Both? The lines that had once seemed so clear to her, between settler and Indian, right and wrong, safety and danger, suddenly blurred. "I'm sorry about your brother," she said finally, the words inadequate even to her own ears. Joseph looked away, his profile sharp against the firelight. "You have lost also. I see it." Eleanor's throat tightened. "My husband, 3 winters ago." He nodded as if this explained everything. Perhaps it did. They fell into an uneasy rhythm over the following days. Joseph regained strength slowly, his resilience evident in the way he pushed through pain to sit upright, then to stand, then to take halting steps across the cabin. Eleanor gave him space when she could, privacy being a luxury in the close quarters. They now shared. She continued her daily chores, eyeing the dwindling supplies that now had to stretch between two people instead of one. They spoke little at first. Joseph watched her with the intensity of someone studying an unfamiliar text, learning the language of her movements and habits. Eleanor found herself doing the same, noting how he always kept his back to a wall, how his hand instinctively reached for a weapon no longer at his side when startled, how he orientated himself by the sun's position, even when indoors. On the sixth day, when Eleanor struggled to bring in firewood against a bitter wind, Joseph appeared at the door. Without a word, he took the load from her arms. The effort cost him. She could see the sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold, but he carried the wood inside and stacked it neatly by the hearth before returning to his pallet. That night, she added extra meat to the stew. The first real conversation came during a snowstorm that howled like a living creature around the cabin walls. Eleanor had taken up her mending, squinting in the lamplight at a tear in one of William's old shirts that she'd given to Joseph. The warrior sat opposite her, working a piece of wood with a small knife she'd reluctantly provided. His hands moved with practiced precision, transforming the plain pine into something with purpose and form. "Your husband," Joseph said suddenly, breaking the companionable silence. "How did he die?" Eleanor's fingers stilled on the fabric. No one had asked her that directly in years, preferring instead to speak around the edges of her grief as if it might be contagious. "Frozen," she answered. "There was a blizzard. He went to help a neighbor and never came home." Joseph nodded, his knife continuing its steady work. "Good death. Helping others." "There are no good deaths," Eleanor replied, sharper than she intended. "All deaths teach something. Good deaths teach courage, sacrifice. And what do bad deaths teach?" Joseph looked up, meeting her gaze directly. "Caution, vengeance. Is that what your brother's death taught you?" His hands stopped moving. For a moment, Eleanor thought she'd gone too far, crossed some invisible boundary between them. Then he resumed his carving, eyes lowered. "My brother died because he trusted. Trader said he had goods to barter. Instead, he had guns, 3 men hiding. They wanted horses, took his life instead." Joseph's voice remained steady, but his knuckles whitened around the knife handle. "I followed. They shot me, left me for dead. You found me after. These men, they were from Clearwater Settlement? No, drifters, but they ride toward your town. To sell horses, they stole from us." Eleanor absorbed this information slowly. Drifters with stolen Shoshone horses would find ready buyers in Clearwater. Few there would question where the animals came from, concerned only with price and quality. "The settlement isn't safe for you," she said. Joseph's smile held no humor. "No place is safe for my kind now." The statement hung between them, bleak and undeniable. Eleanor returned to her mending, but her thoughts raced ahead. Winter still gripped the valley with no sign of releasing its hold. Joseph couldn't travel far in his condition, especially without a horse or proper supplies. Yet harboring him indefinitely risked discovery, particularly when the monthly supply wagon would make its way to her homestead once the trails cleared. "When you are stronger," she said carefully, "where will you go?" "My people camp near Medicine Bend for winter, 20 miles west." He glanced toward the snow-blanketed window. "Cannot travel yet." "No," Eleanor agreed. "Not yet." Neither acknowledged the unspoken agreement that had just formed between them. He would stay until he could safely leave, a temporary arrangement, nothing more. Just 2 survivors sharing shelter against a hostile world. As January yielded to February, Joseph's strength returned in earnest. He began to contribute to the daily work of the homestead, first in small ways, mending a broken chair, sharpening tools, then in larger ones. He chopped wood when Eleanor was occupied with other tasks, repaired a leak in the root cellar, and constructed ingenious traps that yielded more rabbits than her snare lines ever had. Their conversations grew longer, more frequent, Joseph spoke of his people's traditions, of a life that followed the rhythms of seasons and game migrations rather than property lines and deeds. Eleanor shared stories of her childhood in Pennsylvania, of the journey west with William, of the dreams they'd had for the homestead that she now maintained alone. Sometimes they lapsed into comfortable silences that no longer felt like barriers. Between them, Eleanor found herself watching the way firelight played across the planes of his face, highlighting cheekbones and casting shadows beneath eyes that had seen too much of the world's brutality. Joseph crafted a new handle for her, axe carved with subtle patterns that reminded Eleanor of flowing water. She pretended not to notice the medicine symbols worked into the design, small protective wards against injury. In return, she mended his clothing properly, replacing the crude field repairs with neat stitches that would hold through hard use. They were cautious with each other still, maintaining invisible boundaries. Joseph never entered her sleeping area uninvited. Eleanor always announced herself before entering the cabin from outside. They ate from opposite sides of the table, passed objects carefully to avoid brushing fingers, spoke in measured tones that revealed thoughts but seldom feelings. Yet something was changing beneath this careful dance of coexistence. Eleanor caught herself listening for his movements when he was out of sight, found comfort in the sound of his breathing across the darkened cabin at night. Joseph began to use "we" when discussing the homestead's needs, his eyes lingering on her face when he thought she wasn't looking. February brought a brief thaw, turning the snow-packed trail to treacherous mud. Eleanor knew the supply wagon would attempt the journey soon if the weather held. The prospect filled her with unaccountable dread. She was gathering eggs from the henhouse when she heard the approach of horses. Not the familiar plodding of the supply wagon's team, but the lighter tread of riders moving fast. Eleanor's heart lodged in her throat as she peered through a crack in the henhouse wall. 3 men on horseback entered her clearing, leading 2 riderless horses behind them. Their clothes were travel-worn, their faces weather-beaten beneath the brims of dusty hats. One sported a thick beard streaked with grey, another had a scar bisecting his left eyebrow. The third was younger, barely out of boyhood, with restless eyes that darted around the property. Eleanor recognized none of them, but the description matched what Joseph had told her. These were the men who had killed his brother and left him for dead, the drifters with stolen Shoshone horses to sell. She slipped out the back of the henhouse, keeping low as she made her way toward the cabin. Joseph was inside, unaware of the danger approaching. If these men recognized him, or even suspected his presence. She was halfway to the cabin when the bearded man called out, "Hello, the house! Anybody home?" Eleanor straightened, forcing her face into a neutral expression as she changed direction to intercept them before they reached the door. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" she called, one hand casually dropping to the knife at her belt. The men exchanged glances. Clearly they hadn't expected to find a lone woman. The bearded one, obviously their leader, plastered on a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sorry to trouble you, ma'am. We're looking for the main trail to Clearwater Settlement. Seems we got turned around in these hills. The settlement's east of here," Eleanor replied, stopping a careful distance from them. "You follow this track back about 2 miles, then take the fork heading north. Can't miss it." The scarred man's gaze wandered past her to the cabin. "You out here all by yourself, ma'am?" An innocent question with predatory undertones. Eleanor felt cold spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the February air. "My husband's just gone to check the trap lines," she lied smoothly. "Should be back any minute. He doesn't care for unexpected visitors." "Ain't looking to impose," the bearded man said, though his eyes told a different story as they assessed her homestead. "Got some mighty fine horses to sell in town. Thought we might water them here before moving on." As if on cue, one of the riderless horses tossed its head, revealing the distinctive markings of Shoshone breeding, the same patterns Joseph had described his brother's horse bearing. "Well, tanks over there." Eleanor gestured to the far side of the barn, deliberately directing them away from the cabin. "Help yourselves, then be on your way." The youngest of the three fidgeted in his saddle. "Maybe you'd be interested in buying one yourself, ma'am. Fine stock, good price. We have all the horses we need," she answered, the plural deliberate. "And not much in the way of cash or goods to trade?" The bearded man studied her with narrowed eyes. Something in his expression shifted, suspicion replacing opportunism. He opened his mouth to speak when the cabin door opened behind them. Joseph stood in the doorway, Eleanor's rifle held casually in his hands. He'd bound his hair back in the style of a frontiersman and wore William's old coat open over his own clothing, a deliberate blurring of identities that might confuse a quick glance. But his posture and the way he held the rifle spoke volumes. This was a warrior prepared for battle. "Everything all right, Eleanor?" he called, his voice steady, his English suddenly perfect and unaccented. The transformation was so complete that for a moment even Eleanor was startled. Gone was any trace of the wounded Shoshone warrior. In his place stood a frontier husband, territorial and armed, regarding strangers on his property with justified suspicion. The bearded man's hand inched toward his pistol, then stopped as Joseph shifted the rifle slightly in his direction. A moment of tension stretched between them, a silent calculation of risk and reward. "Just giving directions," Eleanor said, her voice carrying a warning for both parties. These gentlemen were about to water their horses and move on. The scarred man was studying Joseph's face with uncomfortable intensity. Eleanor saw the moment recognition began to dawn in his eyes, saw his spine stiffen. "Much obliged for the directions, ma'am," the bearded leader cut in, apparently deciding this particular homestead wasn't worth the trouble. He nodded to his companions. "We'll be on our way once the horses are watered." The three men led their mounts to the water trough, maintaining a careful distance from both Eleanor and Joseph. The scarred one kept glancing back toward the cabin, frowning, as if trying to place a half-remembered face. Joseph remained in the doorway, rifle ready, his expression unreadable as he watched the men who had murdered his brother water the very horses they had stolen from his people. Only Eleanor, who had learned to read the minute shifts in his posture, could see the tension vibrating through him, the effort it cost him not to seek the vengeance he'd pursued before his wounding. When the men finally rode out, taking the east trail as directed, silence descended on the homestead once more. Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding and moved toward the cabin. Joseph lowered the rifle as she approached, his face regaining its usual expressions as the mask of frontiersman fell away. "They will be back," he said simply. Eleanor nodded. The scarred one had recognized Joseph, or at least suspected. Once they reached Clearwater Settlement, questions would be asked. Rumors would spread. "We have time," she replied. "Not much, but some." Joseph studied her face. "We?" The question hung between them, weighted with meaning beyond its single syllable. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "Yes," she said. "We." It was only later, as evening shadows lengthened across the cabin floor, that Eleanor realized the enormity of what she'd done. Not just in harboring Joseph, not just in lying to protect him, but in that single word, "we," that had redefined the boundaries between them. No longer merely two survivors sharing temporary shelter, but something more complex and dangerous. As if reading her thoughts, Joseph looked up from where he sat, cleaning the rifle. "You have chosen a difficult path." Eleanor's hands stilled on the stew she was stirring. "I'm well acquainted with difficult paths. This one may cost more than you wish to pay." "And what would you have me do instead? Turn you out? Hand you over to men like those?" "You could," he said simply. "Many would." "I told you before," Eleanor replied, meeting his gaze across the cabin. "I am not many." The words hung between them, an echo of their first real exchange, but carrying new weight. Joseph nodded slowly, accepting what she offered without pushing for more. That night, as moonlight filtered through the cabin's single window, casting silver patterns across the floorboards, Eleanor lay awake, listening to Joseph's steady breathing from across the room. The men would return, or others would come in their place. The fragile peace they had constructed within these four walls could not withstand the world's intrusion indefinitely. Yet for now, in this moment, they had created something unprecedented between them. Not quite trust, not quite friendship, but a mutual recognition that transcended the artificial boundaries others had drawn between their kinds. It was enough. It had to be enough, for whatever time remained to them. The riders came at dawn, just as Eleanor had feared they would. She'd been awake since before first light, a strange tension having roused her from fitful sleep. Outside, the February thaw continued, dripping from eaves and softening the packed snow into treacherous slush. The sound of multiple horses approaching reached her ears before their riders came into view. Eleanor touched Joseph's shoulder lightly. He was instantly alert, accustomed to waking in danger. "They're coming," she whispered. "Many of them." No need to specify who they were. Joseph nodded once, his face composed but grim. He reached for William's old coat and Eleanor's rifle. "No," she said, staying his hand. "No weapons, not yet." She had spent the night considering their options. Fighting would mean death. If not immediately, then by hanging afterward. Running would mean the same, just delayed by however long it took a posse to track them through melting snow. The only chance, slim as it was, lay in confronting what was coming head-on. "Trust me," she said. Joseph studied her face for a long moment, then released the rifle. "I trust you." The words settled between them, weighty with a significance neither acknowledged aloud. Eleanor straightened her hair and smoothed her skirts. Small, meaningless gestures of preparation. She stepped onto the porch just as the riders entered. A clearing, 7 men on horseback, led by Sheriff Matthew Daniels, a heavy-set man with a bushy mustache and eyes perpetually narrowed in suspicion. Beside him rode Reverend Miller, clutching his Bible like a shield. Behind them came familiar faces: Jacob Whitaker from the general store, Thomas Reynolds, the blacksmith, young Billy Peterson, who'd once asked for Eleanor's hand after William's death, and 2 of the drifters from the previous day, the bearded leader and the one with the scarred face. The sheriff raised his hand, bringing the procession to a halt several yards from the cabin. His gaze flicked past Eleanor to the doorway where Joseph now stood, unarmed but unmistakably present. "Mrs. Blackwood," the sheriff began formally, "we've had some disturbing reports." Eleanor clasped her hands before her, the picture of wifely concern. "What seems to be the trouble, Sheriff?" "These men," he gestured to the drifters, "claim you're harboring an Indian, a Shoshone warrior they encountered up north, who attacked them and killed one of their companions." "That's quite an accusation," Eleanor replied, keeping her voice level. "As you can see, there's no Indian here, just my husband and myself." A ripple of confusion passed through the group. The scarred man leaned forward in his saddle. "That ain't no husband, Sheriff. That's the same redskin who ambushed us. I'd stake my life on it." "A grievous misunderstanding," Eleanor countered smoothly. "This is Joseph Blackwood, my husband of 2 months. We were married by Circuit Judge Wilson when he passed through in December." The lie came easily, built upon the foundation of smaller untruths she'd constructed in the preceding weeks. She felt Joseph shift behind her, adjusting to this new narrative without missing a beat. Reverend Miller frowned deeply. "I've heard nothing of this marriage, Eleanor. Why was it kept secret from the community?" "Not secret, Reverend. Private. After William, I wasn't eager for the settlement's scrutiny or judgment." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "The winter has kept us isolated, as you well know." Sheriff Daniels studied Joseph with naked suspicion. "You expect us to believe you married some drifter without telling a soul?" I expect you to respect my choice, as you would any other widow's, Eleanor replied, a hint of steel entering her voice. Joseph came west from Pennsylvania. We met when he helped clear my north field last autumn. The bearded drifter spat. That's horse shit. Look at him. He's Shoshone, plain as day. His mother was Shoshone, Eleanor amended, the improvisation flowing naturally. His father was a fur trader from Pittsburgh. Joseph was educated at a mission school before coming west. This new detail gave them all pause. Half-breeds were not uncommon on the frontier, though few were welcomed into white society. It made her story just plausible enough to create doubt. Joseph stepped forward, his presence steady beside Eleanor. When he spoke, his English was flawless, his accent a strange blend of Eastern precision and frontier roughness, a masterful performance. Gentlemen, he addressed them with calm dignity, I understand your concerns. These are dangerous times, but I assure you I am not the man these drifters seek. He turned his gaze to the scarred man. I've never seen you before yesterday when you stopped for water. The scarred man's face flushed with anger. You lying son of a... That's enough, Sheriff Daniels cut him off. He dismounted heavily, approaching the porch. If what you say is true, Mrs. Blackwood, you won't mind producing documentation of this marriage. I have the certificate inside, Eleanor lied, heart pounding. Judge Wilson provided it. The sheriff nodded toward the door. Then let's see it. Eleanor led the way into her cabin, acutely aware of Joseph behind her and the sheriff following. Inside, she moved to a small wooden box where she kept William's papers and her deed to the homestead. Her mind raced. There was no certificate to produce, no documentation to support their fabrication. The sheriff stood with thumbs hooked in his belt, waiting. Joseph positioned himself by the hearth, seemingly relaxed but ready to move if necessary. Eleanor opened the box and rifled through papers, buying precious seconds. That's strange, she murmured. I'm sure I placed it right here. Mrs. Blackwood, the sheriff sighed. I think we both know there is no certificate. Eleanor straightened, abandoning the pretense. My marriage doesn't require your validation. Sheriff, no, but harboring a Shoshone warrior does require my intervention. His hand dropped to his pistol. Step aside, ma'am. Joseph tensed, but made no move toward a weapon. There need be no violence here, Sheriff. I have done nothing to deserve your suspicion. Then you won't mind riding into town with us, Daniels replied. We can sort this out proper-like, with Judge Wilson when he makes his monthly circuit next week. Eleanor understood the implication. A week in the settlement jail would mean daily harassment, possible violence, and no guarantee of a fair hearing when the judge arrived. She had seen how frontier justice worked for men with skin like Joseph's. That won't be necessary, came a new voice from the doorway. Reverend Miller stepped inside, his Bible still clutched to his chest. His gaze traveled between Eleanor and Joseph, assessing and calculating. I believe I have a solution that will satisfy all parties, he continued, addressing the sheriff. If these two claim to be married, let us formalize it immediately, under God's law, and with the proper witnesses. Then there can be no question of the man's status. Eleanor blinked, momentarily stunned. The Reverend wasn't offering a rescue. He was proposing a trap disguised as compromise. Once legally bound to Joseph in the eyes of the settlement, she would be inextricably tied to his fate, and he to hers. I don't see how that resolves the accusations made by these drifters, the sheriff objected. Simple, Miller replied. If he's formally married to Mrs. Blackwood, he becomes a legal resident of this territory, subject to its full protection and jurisdiction. The drifters can file a formal complaint with Judge Wilson when he arrives, but they can't demand summary justice against a legal resident. He turned to Joseph. Of course, that means accepting all the responsibilities and limitations that come with such status. The message was clear. Joseph would trade his identity and freedom for protection under White man's law, a gilded cage, but a cage nonetheless. Eleanor looked to Joseph, trying to communicate wordlessly the choice that lay before him. His expression revealed nothing to the men watching, but she could read the minute shifts in his posture, the tension around his eyes. He understood perfectly well what was being offered and what would be required. "I would be honored to formalize my union with Eleanor before God and these witnesses," Joseph said with careful precision. The Reverend nodded, satisfied. "Then let us proceed without delay." What followed was a ceremony stripped of all joy or celebration, a legal formality performed under duress with armed men as witnesses. Reverend Miller recited the marriage rites with mechanical efficiency, while the sheriff and Thomas Reynolds served as witnesses. The drifters watched from the doorway, their accusations temporarily neutralized, but their hatred undiminished. Eleanor spoke her vows in a clear voice, refusing to show hesitation or shame before these men who sought to use marriage as a form of control. Joseph responded in kind, his words measured and dignified. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, no one offered congratulations. Sheriff Daniels folded the newly signed marriage certificate, legitimate this time, and tucked it inside his coat. "I'll file this with the territorial records next time I'm in Cheyenne. In the meantime," he fixed Joseph with a hard stare, "I expect you to conduct yourself as befits a resident of Clearwater Valley. Any trouble, and these men's accusations will be the least of your concerns." "There will be no trouble from us," Eleanor answered before Joseph could speak. "See that there isn't." The sheriff nodded to the others. "Gentlemen, I believe our business here is concluded." The bearded drifter wasn't satisfied. "You're just gonna leave him here after what he did to Frank?" "I'm leaving a legally married man on his own property with his wife," Daniels corrected sharply. "You want justice for your friend? You can make your case to Judge Wilson next week. Until then, I suggest you focus on those horses you came to." "You sell?" The scarred man spat on Eleanor's floor before following his companion outside. Reverend Miller paused at the door, his expression unreadable as he regarded the newly wedded couple. "I'll expect to see you both at Sunday services," he said. "A new marriage should be blessed by the congregation." With that final twist of the knife, a public exhibition demanded as proof of their compliance, he departed, leaving Eleanor and Joseph alone in the suddenly quiet cabin. For a long moment, neither spoke. The fire crackled in the hearth, indifferent to the transformation that had just occurred under its watch. Outside, they could hear the riders departing, hoofbeats fading into the distance. Joseph moved first, crossing to the window to confirm they were truly alone. Eleanor sank into a chair, the weight of what had just transpired settling onto her shoulders like a physical burden. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "This was not what I intended when I brought you here." Joseph turned from the window. "You saved my life? Again? At what cost?" She gestured around the cabin, which now seemed smaller, more confining. "They've trapped us both." "No." Joseph's voice was soft but firm. "They believe they have trapped us. That is not the same thing." Eleanor looked up at him, this man who was now, by law if not by choice, her husband. In the week since she had dragged him half dead from the snow, she had come to respect his strength, his dignity, his resilience. But the word husband carried a weight neither of them had sought to bear. "What happens now?" she asked. Joseph returned to the hearth, kneeling to stoke the fire that had burned low during the confrontation. His movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic. "Now we decide," he said, "whether this paper they have forced upon us will define us, or whether we will define ourselves." Eleanor considered his words. The marriage certificate was both shield and shackle, protection against immediate danger, but a potential constraint on both their futures. Yet there was something liberating in having the choice made for them. The pretense ended. No more lies about Joseph's temporary presence, no more uncertainty about when discovery might come. "We should prepare for Sunday," she said practically. "If we're to attend services as ordered," Joseph nodded, "we will play their game for now. And after," he met her gaze steadily, "after, we make our own rules." The days that followed their forced marriage unfolded with strange normalcy. Eleanor continued her usual routines, tending livestock, preparing meals, mending clothes. Joseph worked alongside her, splitting wood, repairing the chicken coop, clearing drainage ditches to direct the snowmelt away from the cabin foundation. Yet everything had changed. The legal binding between them created new tensions, new considerations. Sleeping arrangements remained as before, Eleanor in the bed, Joseph on a pallet near the hearth. But now these separate spaces felt like a statement rather than simply practical accommodation. Their conversations grew more careful, each aware of boundaries that had been both erased and reinforced by the ceremony. Joseph never presumed upon his new legal rights as a husband. Eleanor never treated him as less than an equal partner in their shared homestead. On Saturday evening, Eleanor washed her hair and laid out her best dress, faded but clean, for the church service they had been commanded to attend. Joseph watched her preparations with a calm that belied the risk they would face the following day. "They will stare," he said matter-of-factly. "They will whisper." "Let them," Eleanor replied, more bravado than confidence in her voice. "We've done nothing wrong." Joseph's smile was tinged with sadness. "In their eyes, your only crime is greater than any I have committed. And what crime is that? You chose to see me as a man, not as a savage." Eleanor's hands stilled on the dress she was smoothing. "Is that what I did?" "It is what you continue to do," Joseph said quietly. "Even now, when it costs you everything." "Not everything," she countered. "I still have this land, this home, and a husband you did not choose." Eleanor hung the dress carefully on a peg. "I chose to bring you here. I chose to protect you. Everything that followed came from those choices." She turned to face him. "I don't regret them." Joseph studied her for a long moment. "You are a remarkable woman, Eleanor Blackwood. And you," she replied with the ghost of a smile, "are not what they believe you to be, Joseph Redhawk." The use of his full name, the name he had shared with her freely before it was recorded on their marriage certificate, seemed to touch something in him. He bowed his head slightly, acknowledging what couldn't be said aloud. Sunday dawned clear and cold, the thaw temporarily arrested by an overnight frost. Eleanor and Joseph rode double on her aging mare, the closeness of their bodies necessitated by circumstances rather than choice. Eleanor felt the solid warmth of him behind her, his hands resting lightly at her waist to maintain balance. Neither spoke during the hour-long ride to the settlement. Clearwater was little more than a cluster of rough-hewn buildings centered around a crossroads. The general store, which doubled as a post office, the blacksmith shop, a small saloon that closed during Sunday services, a schoolhouse, half a dozen family homes, and the whitewashed church that served as the community's heart. As they approached, Eleanor felt Joseph tense, almost imperceptibly. Every instinct must have been urging him to turn back, to flee this place where he was surrounded by potential enemies. Yet he remained steady, helping her dismount with grave courtesy when they reached the hitching post outside the church. Eyes followed them as they made their way toward the entrance, curious, hostile, judgmental gazes that Eleanor met with her chin held high. Joseph walked beside her, neither touching her nor distancing himself, his posture reflecting a dignity that no legal document could confer or remove. Reverend Miller greeted them at the door with professional cordiality that did nothing to mask his disapproval. "Mrs. Blackwood, Mr. Blackwood, how good of you to join us this morning." The use of William's surname applied to Joseph felt like a deliberate erasure, an imposed identity. Eleanor smiled tightly. "We wouldn't miss it, Reverend." Inside, the congregation had already assembled. Conversation died as Eleanor and Joseph entered, leaving a silence broken only by the rustle of clothing and the occasional cough. Eleanor led the way to a pew near the back, acutely aware of the space that opened around them as nearby families shifted to avoid proximity. Only one person nodded in greeting. Sarah Jensen, a young widow whose husband had been killed in a mining accident the previous year. Her small acknowledgement felt like water in a desert. The service proceeded with excruciating slowness. Reverend Miller's sermon, ostensibly about Ruth's loyalty to Naomi, contained thinly veiled references to proper marriage and the dangers of straying from one's own kind. Joseph sat perfectly still throughout, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. Eleanor found herself unable to focus on the words, her attention divided between the palpable hostility surrounding them and her concern for the man beside her. When the Reverend finally called the newly married couple forward for a public blessing, Eleanor felt a momentary panic. They had anticipated this humiliation, but had not discussed how to respond. Joseph solved the dilemma by standing first, offering her his hand with such natural confidence that she took it without hesitation. Together, they walked to the front of the church, facing the congregation that had effectively forced their union. Reverend Miller placed his hands over their joined ones, speaking words of blessing that sounded more like warning. Eleanor barely heard him, her attention caught by Joseph's steady presence beside her and the sea of suspicious faces before them. In that moment, something shifted within her. The fear and resentment she had carried since the forced ceremony began to transmute into something else. Not acceptance, exactly, but defiance. Let them stare. Let them judge. They had sought to punish and control through this marriage, but they could not dictate what it meant to her and Joseph. As they returned to their seat, Eleanor kept her hand in Joseph's, a small act of rebellion against the very institution that had been weaponized against them. His fingers tightened briefly around hers, acknowledgement, perhaps even gratitude. The remainder of the service passed in a blur. When it ended, Eleanor and Joseph made their way quickly outside, avoiding the social hour that typically followed. They had fulfilled their obligation. Nothing required them to endure further scrutiny. As they prepared to leave, Sheriff Daniels intercepted them by their horse. "I've filed your marriage certificate," he informed them without preamble. "It's official now, according to territorial law." "Thank you, Sheriff," Eleanor replied neutrally. "Those drifters are still in town," he continued, his gaze shifting to Joseph. "They're determined to see the judge when he arrives. I'd advise you to stay close to home until this matter is resolved." Joseph nodded once. "We understand." "Do you?" Daniel studied him with narrowed eyes. "Because I'm not convinced you appreciate the position you're in, Mr. Blackwood. One wrong move, one accusation proven true, and that certificate won't protect you." "Is that a threat, Sheriff?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Consider it friendly counsel," Daniels replied, though nothing in his tone suggested friendship. "Good day to you both." They rode home in silence, the weight of the community's judgment, and the sheriff's warning pressing down upon them. The temporary safety they had secured through marriage now felt as fragile as spring ice on the river, a surface that might give way at any moment. As the cabin came into view, Joseph spoke for the first time since leaving the church. "They will never accept this." Eleanor knew he meant more than just their marriage. "No," she agreed, "they won't. And yet," he said thoughtfully, "they have given us something they did not intend." "What's that?" "Time. And a choice." Eleanor considered his words as they dismounted. Time to plan, perhaps. Time to decide what this forced union would mean to them, beyond the legal document that bound them together. And a choice about how to move forward, as reluctant players, in the settlement's game, or as architects of their own destiny. As they entered the cabin together, their shared home now by law as well as circumstance, Eleanor recognized that the path ahead remained fraught with danger. But for the first time since the riders had appeared at dawn, she felt a curious sense of possibility rather than constraint. They had been forced into a union neither had chosen. Yet within that imposition, a space had opened for something neither had anticipated, the freedom to define what marriage might mean between two people from worlds that had never been intended to meet. March arrived with the persistence of a creditor, demanding payment in the form of thaws and freezes that transformed the land around the cabin into a patchwork of mud and ice. A week had passed since the forced marriage ceremony, and in that time Eleanor and Joseph had settled into a new rhythm of coexistence, a dance of respectful distance and growing understanding. The journey to town for Sunday services had become a weekly ordeal of silent hostility and whispered judgment. Eleanor bore it with rigid dignity, while Joseph observed everything with the calm watchfulness of a man accustomed to being viewed as a threat. They attended because they must, fulfilling the letter of Reverend Miller's command, then retreated to the sanctuary of their shared homestead. On this particular afternoon, Eleanor knelt in what would become their garden when the ground softened enough for planting. Though the earth remained too frozen for cultivation, she cleared away winter debris, her hands grateful for purposeful work. Joseph had gone to check trap lines along the creek, carrying William's old hunting rifle, a necessity now that the drifters remained in Clearwater, waiting for the circuit judge's arrival. Eleanor sat back on her heels, wiping a strand of hair from her face with the back of her wrist. The sun had momentarily broken through the clouds, bringing a deceptive warmth that wouldn't last. In these brief moments of solitude, she allowed herself to contemplate the strange turn her life had taken. The legal document that bound her to Joseph felt both meaningless and profound, a hollow formality forced upon them, yet one that had irrevocably altered their relationship. They were not husband and wife in any true sense, yet neither were they merely two survivors sharing shelter. Something else had formed between them, something without name or precedent. The sound of approaching footsteps roused her from these thoughts. Eleanor rose, expecting Joseph, but found instead Sarah Jensen standing at the edge of the clearing, a basket over her arm. "Sarah," Eleanor said, surprise evident in her voice. No one from the settlement had visited since the marriage, aside from the supply wagon driver who'd completed his monthly delivery with uncomfortable haste. Sarah offered a tentative smile. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all." Eleanor brushed dirt from her skirts. "What brings you all this way?" "I had business with the Harrises down the valley," Sarah explained, referring to a family whose farm lay a mile south. "Thought I might stop on my way back." She hesitated. "And I brought some seedlings for your garden. Tomatoes I started indoors. They'll need a few more weeks before planting, but—" She extended the basket, a peace offering in the form of green, shoots nestled in small cloth bundles. Eleanor accepted it with genuine gratitude. "Thank you. That's very kind." Sarah glanced toward the cabin. Is Mr. Blackwood here?" The careful neutrality in her tone spoke volumes. Not hostile, but uncertain. Curious rather than judgmental. "Joseph's checking traps," Eleanor replied. "He should return shortly. Would you like some tea while you wait?" The invitation surprised them both. Social calls had not been part of Eleanor's life since William's death, and Sarah's presence represented a potential bridge to the community that had ostracized them. Sarah nodded. "I'd like that." Inside the cabin, Eleanor busied herself with the kettle, while Sarah took in her surroundings with poorly disguised curiosity. Evidence of Joseph's presence was everywhere. A half-carved piece of wood on the table, a bow hanging beside the door, moccasins drying near the hearth. "It's cozy," Sarah offered, settling on a chair Eleanor indicated. "It serves us well enough." Sarah fidgeted with her shawl. "Eleanor, the way folks have been treating you since the marriage, it isn't right." Eleanor paused in measuring tea leaves. "Few seem to share that opinion. Fear makes people cruel," Sarah said simply. "After my Henry died, they treated me like I was made of glass, like widowhood was catching. Then when I started taking in laundry to support myself, they decided I was pitiful. Either way, they couldn't see me as just Sarah anymore." Eleanor recognized the truth in those words. Communities often preferred their members to fit neatly into familiar categories. A woman alone upset that order. A white woman married to a Shoshone man shattered it completely. "How did you meet him?" Sarah asked suddenly. "Truly, I mean." The question hung between them, freighted with implications. Eleanor measured her response carefully. "I found him wounded in the snow during the January blizzard," she said finally, deciding that a partial truth was better than a complete fabrication. "He would have died if I'd left him there." Sarah absorbed this information without visible shock. "And the marriage?" "Was not our idea," Eleanor admitted, setting a steaming cup before her guest. "But it has served its purpose." "Which is?" "Survival." Sarah sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Is that all it is?" Before Eleanor could respond, the door opened. Joseph entered, game bag over his shoulder, his expression guarded when he spotted their visitor. He nodded respectfully to Sarah, who returned the gesture with only slight hesitation. "Mrs. Jensen came bearing tomato seedlings," Eleanor explained, moving to take the rabbits he'd caught. Their hands brushed in the exchange, a moment of contact that did not go unnoticed by Sarah. "A kind gesture," Joseph said, his English as precise as it had been during the confrontation with the sheriff. "We appreciate your thoughtfulness." Sarah studied him openly, curiosity overcoming caution. "Mr. Blackwood, I hope you'll forgive my directness, but I've wondered, how did you come to be in these parts?" Joseph glanced at Eleanor, a silent question passing between them. How much truth was safe to share? Eleanor gave an almost imperceptible nod. "I was traveling to find my people," he said carefully. "There was trouble on the journey." "Your people," Sarah repeated. "The Shoshone?" "My mother's people," Joseph clarified. "My father was a fur trader from the East. This part of their fabrication contained elements of truth. Joseph had indeed been seeking his people when the drifters attacked him and his brother. The rest remained unspoken. The brother's death, Joseph's pursuit of the killers, the bullet that had nearly claimed his life. Sarah nodded, accepting this partial explanation. "Well, I should start back before the light fails." She rose, setting down her cup. "Thank you for the tea, Eleanor." At the door, she paused. "The judge arrives tomorrow. Those men, the drifters, they've been talking all over town about their plans to press charges." Eleanor's stomach tightened. What kind of reception can Joseph expect? "Judge Parker is a fair man," Sarah said carefully, "but he's also practical. The territory has enough trouble without—" She trailed off. "Without complications like us," Eleanor finished for her. Sarah's expression softened. "Come by my place before you see the judge. Henry left some papers that might help your case." With that cryptic offer she departed, leaving Eleanor and Joseph to contemplate this unexpected alliance. As the door closed behind Sarah, Joseph turned to Eleanor. "She knows more than she says." "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "But she came anyway." "Why?" Eleanor considered the question. "Perhaps because she understands what it means to exist outside the settlement's expectations." Joseph nodded slowly. "One ally is better than none. Even a tentative one," Eleanor added, taking the rabbits to the table for skinning. They worked in companionable silence, the afternoon light slanting through the windows as they prepared the evening meal together. Joseph built up the fire while Eleanor cleaned the game, their movements complementary and practiced. In these domestic moments, the artifice of their marriage receded, replaced by the simple reality of two people creating a shared life. Later, as they ate by firelight, Joseph spoke of his day's observations, tracks he'd seen along the creek, the early migration of birds returning north, signs of beaver activity where none had been before. Eleanor listened, recognizing these details as more than idle conversation. He was mapping their surroundings, identifying resources, noting changes that might represent opportunity or threat. "Spring comes earlier here than in the mountains where my people winter," he remarked, his English relaxing into its natural cadence, now that no outsiders were present to judge. "Does that make you homesick?" Eleanor asked, realizing she knew little of his life before their paths crossed. Joseph considered the question, his face reflective in the firelight. "Home is not a place for my people. It is wherever the band travels together, family, traditions." He paused. "I miss those things, yes." "Tell me about them," Eleanor said softly, "if you want to." He studied her for a moment, as if weighing whether such sharing was safe. Then slowly, deliberately, he began to speak of the Shoshone ways, the seasonal migrations that followed game and weather, the ceremonies that marked life's transitions, the intricate relationships between families and bands that ensured survival. In harsh landscapes, Eleanor listened, asking occasional questions, but mostly absorbing this glimpse into a world parallel to her own, yet governed by entirely different principles. When Joseph described the communal raising of children, where every adult took responsibility for teaching and protecting the young, she found herself thinking of the cold isolation of settler life by comparison. "And your brother?" she asked, gently. "The one who was killed. What was he like?" Pain flickered across Joseph's features, but he did not withdraw. Swift Elk was young, proud, hot-blooded sometimes, but kind to those weaker than himself. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "He could ride before he could walk," our mother said. "I'm sorry I never met him," Eleanor said sincerely. "He would have liked you," Joseph replied. "He admired courage." The compliment, unexpected and genuine, warmed something within Eleanor. It was the first time Joseph had spoken so directly of his assessment of her character. "What about your family?" he asked. "In Pennsylvania, you never speak of them." Eleanor sighed, setting aside her empty bowl. "My father was a schoolteacher, very proper, very certain of his place in the world. My mother died when I was young. I have a sister in Boston, married to a banker. They did not approve of your coming west." "No," she confirmed, "especially not with William, who had no fortune or position to recommend him, just dreams and strong hands." She traced the grain of the wooden table, remembering. "They wrote when he died, urged me to return east, to rejoin civilized society, as my father put it." "Why didn't you?" The question was simple but profound. Eleanor had asked herself the same many times over the years since William's death. At first it was stubbornness, she admitted. "I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of being right." Then it became about honoring what William and I had started here. She looked up, meeting Joseph's gaze directly. "But mostly, I stayed because this land had become part of me, or I had become part of it. Either way, I couldn't imagine belonging anywhere else." Joseph nodded, understanding in his eyes. "And now, with everything changed?" "Now," Eleanor considered his question carefully. "Now I stay, because this is still my home, our home," she amended, acknowledging the legal reality that bound them. "At least until circumstances dictate otherwise." "And if they do?" Joseph pressed. "If staying becomes impossible?" The question hung between them, weighted with unspoken possibilities. Eleanor realized he was asking whether she would abandon him if forced to choose between her land and his safety. "Then we would face that together," she said firmly. "This marriage may have been forced upon us, but I meant the vows I spoke." Surprise flickered across Joseph's features, quickly replaced by something deeper. Respect, perhaps even gratitude. He didn't respond immediately, instead rising to add wood to the fire. The flames leapt higher, casting his profile in sharp relief against the darkened cabin. "Among my people," he said finally, "marriage is not just between two people. It joins families, creates obligations that extend beyond the couple." He turned to face her. "I have no family here to offer you, no status or protection to provide." "I'm not asking for those things." "No," he agreed, "you never have, which makes me wonder what you are asking for, Eleanor Blackwood." The directness of his question caught her off guard. What did she want from this arrangement that had been thrust upon them? Security? Companionship? Something more complicated that she hesitated to name even to herself. "I want what I've always wanted," she answered honestly. "To live according to my own conscience, not the dictates of others. To build something meaningful from the materials life has provided." She met his gaze steadily. "And I want you to have the chance to do the same." Joseph absorbed her words, his expression thoughtful. "Then we want the same things." A curious warmth spread through Eleanor at this simple alignment of purpose. Not romance or passion, but something equally powerful. Mutual recognition of shared values and complementary strengths. "Tomorrow will test that," she said, returning to practical concerns. "The judge's arrival changes everything." Joseph nodded. "We should accept Sarah Jensen's offer. See what papers her husband left that might help us." "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "And we should prepare for the worst. The drifters won't abandon their accusations easily." "They want blood," Joseph said matter-of-factly. "Mine, specifically." "They won't get it," Eleanor stated with quiet force. "Not while I have breath in my body." A smile ghosted across Joseph's face, genuine if fleeting. "Then I must ensure you keep breathing, wife." The term, spoken without irony or resentment, shifted something in the atmosphere between them. It acknowledged their legal status while transforming it into something chosen rather than imposed. Eleanor found herself smiling in return. "And are you, husband?" The next morning dawned grey and threatening, clouds hanging low over the valley like ill omens. Eleanor and Joseph rode toward town earlier than usual, hoping to meet with Sarah before the judge's proceedings began. The journey felt weightier than their previous trips to Clearwater, each hoofbeat bringing them closer to a reckoning neither could fully predict. Sarah's home stood at the eastern edge of the settlement, a modest cabin with a well-tended yard that reflected its owner's determined self-sufficiency. She met them at the door, quickly ushering them inside, before curious eyes could linger on the visitors. "Judge Parker arrived last night," she informed them without preamble. "Those drifters were waiting," bent his ear over whiskey at the saloon. According to Mrs. Whitaker, Eleanor removed her shawl, apprehension tightening her shoulders. "That doesn't bode well." "Maybe not," Sarah acknowledged, "but the judge knows their kind. Drifters with questionable stories are common enough in these parts." She moved to a small chest, withdrawing a leather portfolio. "These might help balance the scales." Joseph accepted the portfolio, opening it carefully. Inside were official-looking documents bearing territorial seals and formal language. His brow furrowed as he examined them. "These are land grants," Sarah explained, "and survey maps. My Henry worked as an assistant to the territorial surveyor before we settled here. These papers document the official boundaries established." "With the Shoshone 3 years ago," Eleanor leaned closer to examine the maps. "How does this help us?" "Look at the dates and locations," Sarah directed. pointing to specific markings. The attack these men described, the one where they claimed Joseph killed their friend, supposedly happened near Bear Creek Pass. According to these surveys, that's well within the protected Shoshone hunting grounds established by the last treaty. Understanding dawned on Eleanor's face. So if they were there, they were trespassing on protected tribal lands, Sarah finished. And any action Joseph might have taken, not that we're admitting he took any, would have been justified defense of sovereign territory. Joseph studied the documents with renewed interest. The territorial government recognizes these boundaries. Paper, yes, Sarah said with a hint of cynicism. Whether they enforce them is another matter, but Judge Parker respects the letter of the law, even when it favors native claims. Hope flickered to life within Eleanor. Sarah, this could make all the difference. It's the least I can do, the younger woman replied. After Henry died, you were the only one who treated me like I was still capable of making my own decisions. She glanced at Joseph. And everyone deserves a fair hearing, regardless of where they come from. Joseph inclined his head slightly, acknowledging both the gift and the principle behind it. Thank you, Mrs. Jensen. Sarah, she corrected with a small smile. We outcasts should use first names, don't you think? The moment of solidarity was interrupted by the church bell tolling the hour. Sarah's expression grew serious once more. The judge will begin hearings at the schoolhouse in half an hour. You should arrive separately from those papers. Less connection to me that way. I'll come later as if I'm just curious about the proceedings. Eleanor recognized the wisdom in this strategy. Sarah was risking her own precarious position in the community by helping them. No need to advertise her involvement prematurely. As they prepared to leave, Sarah caught Eleanor's arm. Whatever happens today, you're not alone anymore. Remember that. Eleanor squeezed her hand in silent gratitude. The words echoed in her mind as she and Joseph made their way toward the schoolhouse where Judge Parker would determine their fate. Not alone anymore. It had been so long since she'd felt part of any community that the simple assertion struck her with unexpected force. She glanced at Joseph, walking beside her with the quiet dignity that seemed as much a part of him as his shadow. Something had shifted between them during the past weeks, a gradual transformation from strangers thrown together by circumstance to partners facing adversity with shared purpose. Their marriage certificate might have been forced upon them, but what they'd built within its confines was entirely their own creation. As they approached the schoolhouse, where a crowd had already gathered to witness the day's proceedings, Eleanor felt Joseph's hand briefly touch hers, not grasping, just a momentary point of contact. A reminder that whatever challenges awaited them inside, they would face them not as victim and rescuer, not as Shoshone and settler, but as two people who had chosen to stand together when the world insisted they remain apart. The schoolhouse had been transformed into a makeshift courtroom, with desks pushed against walls and benches arranged in rows facing the teacher's desk, where Judge Ezekiel Parker now presided. A tall man with silver hair and a neatly trimmed beard, the judge carried himself with the confident authority of someone accustomed to having the final word. Eleanor and Joseph sat together at the front, facing not only the judge, but the scrutiny of nearly every resident of Clearwater Settlement. Behind them, Eleanor could feel the weight of stares, some curious, others hostile. The bearded drifter and his scarred companion sat opposite them, flanked by Sheriff Daniels. Sarah Jensen had slipped in quietly, taking a seat near the back where her presence would attract minimal attention. Judge Parker called the proceedings to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. "This court is now in session," he announced, his voice carrying the distinctive accent of Virginia aristocracy. "We are here to address complaints brought by Mr. Frank Hollister and Mr. James Reed against one Joseph Blackwood, formerly known as Joseph Redhawk, concerning events that transpired approximately 6 weeks ago near Bear Creek Pass. He peered over his spectacles at the drifters. "Mr. Hollister, as the principal complainant, please state your grievance for the record." The bearded man, Hollister, rose, adjusting his belt with practiced swagger. "Thank you, Your Honor. Me and my associates were traveling peacefully through the territory when we were set upon by a band of Shoshone. They killed our friend Lucas Wells and would have killed us too if we hadn't defended ourselves." He pointed dramatically at Joseph. "That man there was among them. He came at me personally like with a knife. I shot him in self-defense, thought I'd killed him. Now I find he's alive and well, living as a so-called settler and married to a white woman, no less." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Judge Parker silenced them with a raised hand. "These are serious accusations, Mr. Hollister. Do you have any witnesses besides Mr. Reed to corroborate your account? Our third companion would have testified, but he's gone to Fort Bridger on business," Hollister replied smoothly. "But we got the dead man's possessions as proof, and the bullet wound in that Indian's side speaks for itself." The judge nodded thoughtfully, then turned to Joseph. "Mr. Blackwood, how do you respond to these allegations?" Joseph rose with quiet dignity. Eleanor marveled at his composure, his ability to stand tall before a room of people who had already judged him in their hearts. "Your Honor," he began, his English precise and measured, "these men are not telling the truth. They were not traveling peacefully, as they claim. They were trespassing on protected Shoshone hunting grounds established by territorial treaty. 3 years ago," he placed Sarah's documents on the table before him, "I have here the official survey maps and treaty specifications that clearly show Bear Creek Pass falls within the boundaries reserved for Shoshone use under Agreement 1872-13, signed by the territorial governor himself." Judge Parker's eyebrows lifted with interest. He gestured for the papers, which Sheriff Daniels collected and brought to him. The judge examined them carefully, adjusting his spectacles. "These appear to be in order," he muttered, almost to himself. He looked up sharply. "Mr. Hollister, were you aware you were on protected tribal land?" Hollister shifted uncomfortably. "We was just passing through, Your Honor, following game trails. Didn't see any signs or markers saying whose land was whose." "Ignorance of boundaries is not a defense," the judge replied dryly. "Please continue." "Mr. Blackwood." Joseph nodded. "My brother and I were hunting when we encountered these men. They had shot an elk, our elk, on our land, and were dressing it out. When my brother approached to question them, the man called Lucas drew his weapon. There was a struggle. Lucas was killed, not by us, but by his own gun discharging in the fight." Hollister jumped to his feet. "That's a damn lie. You savages ambushed us." "Order." Judge Parker slammed his gavel. "You'll have your chance to respond, Mr. Hollister." He turned back to Joseph. "Continue." "These men then opened fire on us. My brother was killed instantly. I was wounded but managed to escape into the forest. They pursued me for some distance before giving up the chase." Joseph's voice remained steady, but Eleanor could see the muscle in his jaw tightening with suppressed emotion. "I traveled for 2 days with my wound before collapsing near Mrs. Blackwood's homestead. She found me and saved my life." "And subsequently married you," the judge observed, glancing at Eleanor. "Rather unusual circumstances for a matrimonial union." Eleanor rose to stand beside Joseph. "If I may, Your Honor." The judge nodded permission. "Joseph and I were married after his recovery, yes," she stated clearly enough for everyone to hear. "The circumstances were our own business, but the marriage is legal and binding, as Sheriff Daniels can confirm." The sheriff reluctantly nodded when the judge looked his way. Judge Parker steepled his fingers. "Mrs. Blackwood, did you witness the events at Bear Creek Pass?" "No, Your Honor. My knowledge of those events comes from my husband's account, which I believe to be truthful. A wife cannot testify on behalf of her husband," Hollister's companion Reed called out. "Everyone knows that," "Thank you for your legal expertise, Mr. Reed," the judge replied with cutting sarcasm. "However, I am well aware of the rules of evidence." He turned back to Joseph. "Do you have any proof beyond these boundary documents to support your version of events?" For the first time, Joseph hesitated. "Only this, Your Honor." He reached into his shirt and withdrew a small leather pouch suspended from a cord around his neck. Opening it carefully, he removed what appeared to be a flattened bullet. "The bullet that passed through my side," he explained. "Mrs. Blackwood removed it during my recovery. If examined, it will match Mr. Hollister's rifle, a Spencer carbine with distinctive rifling marks." Judge Parker's eyebrows rose again. "You seem quite knowledgeable about firearms, Mr. Blackwood." "My father was a trader," Joseph replied, maintaining their established narrative. "I learned about many kinds of weapons from him." The judge gestured for the bullet to be brought forward. He examined it closely, then looked at Hollister. "Mr. Hollister, I presume you still have the rifle in question?" The drifter's face darkened. "I do, but I don't see why." "Sheriff Daniels, please retrieve Mr. Hollister's rifle from wherever he's staying," Judge Parker interrupted. "We'll examine it against this bullet." As the sheriff departed on this errand, the judge addressed the assembled crowd. "We'll take a brief recess while we await the evidence. Court will reconvene in 30 minutes. As the room erupted in conversation, Eleanor and Joseph retreated to a corner. Sarah joined them moments later, her expression cautiously optimistic. "The boundary documents made an impression," she whispered, "and the bullet was inspired." Joseph nodded. "The judge seems fair, but fairness may not be enough against the weight of prejudice." "One step at a time," Eleanor counseled, though her own anxiety thrummed beneath her composed exterior. "At least he's willing to consider evidence rather than simply taking their word over yours." They fell silent as Reverend Miller approached, his Bible clutched as always to his chest like a shield. "An interesting defense you've mounted," he observed, his tone deliberately neutral, "though I wonder if it addresses the fundamental issue at hand." "And what issue would that be, Reverend?" Eleanor asked, though she already knew the answer. "Whether a man of Mr. Blackwood's background can truly be integrated into our community," he replied. "Legal arguments aside, there are practical considerations about harmony and shared values." Joseph met the Reverend's gaze directly. "I have harmed no one in your community, broken no laws, violated no principles that I can discern. What shared values would you have me demonstrate?" The directness of the question seemed to discomfit Miller. "Well, there's church attendance, of course, which you've maintained, and respectable employment." "My husband works our land," Eleanor interjected. "As respectable an employment as any in this valley." "Yes, and we contribute to the community," she continued. "Our taxes are paid, our fences maintained, our livestock contained. What more would satisfy you, Reverend?" Before Miller could respond, a commotion at the door signaled the sheriff's return. He carried Hollister's rifle, along with something else wrapped in cloth. The Reverend retreated, his argument unfinished but his disapproval plain. When court reconvened, tension filled the room like smoke. Judge Parker examined the rifle carefully, comparing its barrel to the flattened bullet Joseph had provided. His expression revealed nothing as he completed his inspection. "Mr. Hollister," he finally addressed the bearded drifter, "this bullet could indeed have been fired from your rifle, though I'm no ballistics expert. However, what interests me more is what Sheriff Daniels discovered while retrieving your weapon." He unwrapped the cloth bundle the sheriff had brought, revealing several items: beaded moccasins, a decorated knife sheath, and a distinctive necklace of bear claws. "These items were found among your possessions," the judge stated. "Can you explain how you came by them?" Hollister shrugged with forced nonchalance. "Traded for 'em. Lots of Indian trinkets change hands in these parts." "Curious," Judge Parker remarked, "because these bear distinct Shoshone craftsmanship and personal markings. Mr. Blackwood, do you recognize any of these items?" Joseph approached slowly, his composure slipping for the first time as he gazed upon the artifacts. His fingers hovered over the bear-claw necklace. "This belonged to my brother," he said quietly. "It was our father's before him. Swift Elk would never have traded it willingly." "This proves nothing," Hollister protested. "He could be lying." "Perhaps," the judge agreed, "but it does raise serious questions about your account." He sat back, his expression grave. "Here is what we know with certainty. Bear Creek Pass lies within protected Shoshone territory, according to official territorial treaties. You, Mr. Hollister, admit to being present there with your companions. You admit to shooting Mr. Blackwood, and you are in possession of items that appear to have belonged to his deceased brother." He stroked his beard thoughtfully. "While I cannot determine precisely what occurred that day, the evidence suggests you were, at minimum, trespassing on protected land and engaged in hunting activities forbidden by treaty. At worst, you may have committed murder and attempted to cover it with false accusations." The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Hollister's face flushed with anger. "You're taking the word of a savage over white men? This is an outrage." Judge Parker's expression hardened. "I'm taking the word of documented territorial boundaries and physical evidence over unsubstantiated claims, Mr. Hollister. And I'll remind you that Mr. Blackwood is now a legal resident of this territory, married to a respected landowner, and entitled to the same protections as any citizen." He straightened, his decision apparently reached. "Here is my ruling. The complaints against Joseph Blackwood are dismissed for lack of evidence. Furthermore, Mr. Hollister and Mr. Reed, you are hereby fined $20 each for treaty violations and warned to stay clear of protected tribal lands in the future." He raised his voice over Hollister's sputtered objections. "Additionally, these items," he gestured to the beaded goods, "will be returned to Mr. Blackwood as rightful family property. Should the Shoshone lodge formal complaints regarding the death of Swift Elk, you may face more serious charges at a later date." With 3 decisive strikes of his gavel, Judge Parker concluded the proceedings. "Court is adjourned." The schoolhouse emptied slowly, the residents of Clearwater processing this unexpected outcome with varying degrees of acceptance. Some nodded grudgingly to Eleanor as they passed. Others avoided looking at Joseph entirely. The drifters stormed out, Hollister muttering threats under his breath that the sheriff pretended not to hear. Eleanor, Joseph, and Sarah remained seated until most had gone. Only then did Eleanor release the breath she'd been holding, her shoulders slumping slightly with relief. "It's over," she whispered. "This part," Joseph corrected gently, gathering his brother's possessions with reverent hands. "Not all." Judge Parker approached them as the last onlookers departed. "Mrs. Blackwood, Mr. Blackwood," he acknowledged with a nod, "an unusual situation you found yourselves in." "Thank you for your fairness, Your Honor," Eleanor replied. The judge waved away. "Her gratitude. I merely applied the law as written. Though," he added, with a pointed look at Joseph, "you should know that law exists in a delicate balance with public sentiment out here. Today's ruling may have satisfied legal requirements, but it has not necessarily changed hearts and minds." "We're aware of that reality," Joseph responded. "Good." Parker gathered his papers. "Because those men will be leaving town, but you must continue living here. I suggest you tread carefully in the coming weeks. Give the community time to adjust to circumstances." With that circumspect advice, he departed, leaving them to contemplate the path forward. The ride home passed in contemplative silence, each absorbed in private thoughts. Only when the cabin came into view did Eleanor speak. "What will you do with your brother's possessions?" Joseph's hand moved to the bear-claw necklace now hanging around his own neck. "Honor them. Remember him in my people's way." They stabled the horse together, then entered the cabin that had become their shared home. The familiar surroundings felt different somehow. no longer a temporary shelter but something they had defended together, and in doing so, made truly their own. Eleanor built a fire while Joseph prepared a simple meal. The domesticity of these actions struck her suddenly. How easily they had fallen into complementary roles, how naturally they anticipated each other's movements. Not husband and wife in the traditional sense, perhaps, but partners in a way that transcended conventional definitions. As twilight deepened into night, Joseph placed Swift Elk's moccasins and knife sheath on the mantel above the fireplace. He stood before them in silence for a long moment, then spoke softly in Shoshone, a prayer, perhaps, or a promise. Eleanor waited, giving him the privacy of this communion with his past. When he finally turned away from the makeshift shrine, his expression had changed subtly, a weight lifted or perhaps redistributed. "My brother can rest now," he said simply. "And you?" Eleanor asked. "Can you rest too?" Joseph considered her question with characteristic thoughtfulness. "Not yet," he admitted, "but I can breathe, move forward." In what direction? The question had been building within her since the judge's ruling, though she'd hesitated to voice it directly. Now it hung between them, unavoidable. Joseph moved to the table where Sarah's boundary document still lay. He traced the lines marking Shoshone territory with a gentle finger. "My people are here," he said, indicating the western regions. 20 miles, as I told you before. With spring coming, they will be moving to the summer hunting grounds. Eleanor nodded, a hollow feeling expanding in her chest. Of course, he would want to return to his people now that his name had been cleared and his brother's possessions recovered. The marriage that bound them had served its purpose, protecting him from false accusations. What reason did he have to remain? "I understand," she said, keeping her voice steady. "You should go to them. They're your family." Joseph looked up, studying her with that penetrating gaze that seemed to see beyond surface meanings. "They are," he agreed, "but they are not the only family I have now." Eleanor's breath caught. "What are you saying?" He straightened, facing her directly. "I'm saying that choices lie before us both. I could return to my people alone. You could remain here alone. Or, she prompted when he paused, or we could choose a new path, together." The proposition hung in the air between them, not a passionate declaration, but something more profound, an acknowledgement of the bond that had formed through shared struggle and mutual respect. "What would that look like?" Eleanor asked, her practical nature asserting itself even as her heart raced. "This land has been my home for 7 years. Your people have been yours for a lifetime." Joseph nodded, acknowledging the complexity. "I don't have all answers, only questions we must consider together." He moved closer, not touching her but reducing the distance between them. "Can a Shoshone man and a white woman build a life that honors both worlds? Can we create something new from what circumstances have given us?" Eleanor found herself breathless at the possibilities his words opened before her. Not just continuing, as they were, maintaining the facade of a conventional marriage while living parallel lives under one roof, but truly building something unique, something chosen rather than imposed. "People would still talk," she said, thinking aloud. "They'd never fully accept." "People will always talk," Joseph replied with unexpected lightness. "Even among my people there would be questions, doubts. We would be between worlds wherever we chose to stand." "Between," Eleanor repeated thoughtfully, "or perhaps bridging them." The idea took root as she spoke it, not outsiders to both communities, but potential connectors. The notion was radical, possibly naive, yet stirred something deep within. Joseph seemed to sense her thoughts. It would not be an easy path. "No," she agreed with a small smile, "but when have either of us chosen the easy path?" He returned her smile, that rare, transformative expression that revealed the man beneath the careful composure. Slowly, with deliberate intent that gave her every opportunity to withdraw, he reached for her hand. Eleanor met him halfway, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that felt more intimate than any embrace could have been. They stood thus connected, the firelight casting their joined shadows against the cabin wall. Two separate silhouettes merged into a single, indivisible form. No words passed between them. None were needed. In that moment of chosen connection, something fundamental shifted. The forced union imposed by the settlement transmuted into something authentic, something freely given and received. Later that night, Eleanor sat by the window while Joseph slept. Outside, stars pierced the darkness like distant beacons, illuminating possibilities she had never dared consider before. The path ahead remained uncertain, fraught with challenges neither could fully anticipate. Yet the fear that might once have accompanied such uncertainty had been replaced by something else, a quiet determination to forge meaning from circumstances that had once seemed only constraining. She watched Joseph's peaceful form, remembering the wounded stranger she had, dragged from the snow months earlier. How impossible it would have seemed then that his presence would so completely transform her understanding of home, of belonging, of connection. The legal document that bound them, created to control and limit, had paradoxically opened. A door to growth neither could have achieved alone. Eleanor touched the simple band on her finger, not William's ring, which she had kept in a small box with his other personal effects, but a new one Joseph had carved from antler after their courthouse ceremony. Not valuable by any conventional measure, yet precious beyond accounting because it represented choice rather than obligation. Tomorrow would bring decisions, plans, negotiations with both the settlement and, potentially, Joseph's people. There would be resistance, misunderstanding, perhaps even danger. But tonight, in the quiet sanctuary they had created together, Eleanor allowed herself to imagine a future defined not by what they had lost or what had been taken from them, but by what they might build together. A life between worlds. A bridge, rather than a boundary. A marriage of choice, not circumstance. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with tentative light, Eleanor finally lay down beside Joseph, not touching, but close enough to feel the reassurance of his presence. He shifted in his sleep, murmuring something in Shoshone that she couldn't understand but somehow knew was peaceful. In that moment, on the threshold between night and day, between past and future, Eleanor Blackwood made her choice. Whatever path they forged together, however difficult the journey might prove, she would walk it with her head held high, her heart open to possibilities neither the settlement nor Joseph's people might yet imagine. Not because fate had thrust them together, but because they had discovered something worth preserving in the crucible of their shared adversity. A vision of connection that transcended the artificial boundaries others had drawn between their worlds. April brought a rush of green to Clearwater Valley, the land awakening from winter's grip with explosive vitality. The homestead flourished. Under Eleanor and Joseph's combined care, garden rose, planted with careful precision, fruit trees pruned and flowering, fences mended against summer predators. They had fallen into a rhythm of shared purpose, their days filled with the practical work of survival and planning. The weeks following Judge Parker's ruling had passed with cautious normality. They continued attending Sunday services, enduring the mixed reception of the settlement with quiet dignity. Some, like Sarah Jensen and the blacksmith Thomas Reynolds, had begun to accept their unusual union, offering small gestures of community, a shared meal after church, assistance with a broken wagon wheel. Others maintained a frigid distance, their disapproval evident in averted gazes and conversations that died at their approach. On this particular morning, Eleanor stood at the garden's edge, surveying the tender shoots pushing through recently tilled soil. The tangible results of their labor gave her profound satisfaction, proof that something new could grow from unpromising circumstances when tended with care and patience. Joseph approached from the cabin, a letter in hand. "Supply wagon delivered. Mail," he said, offering her the envelope. "From your sister in Boston." Eleanor accepted it with mixed emotions. Her last correspondence with Elizabeth had been strained. Her sister's well-meaning but condescending concern about Eleanor's continued isolation in the wilderness had prompted a defensive response. Now, taking the letter, she noticed the unusual thickness of the envelope. "Thank you," she said, tucking it into her pocket for later consideration. "The seedlings look strong." Joseph nodded, his gaze traveling beyond the garden to the distant mountains. "The pass will be clear soon." The simple observation carried significant weight. They had been discussing the possibility of visiting Joseph's people when travel became practical, a journey both exciting and daunting for Eleanor. Though Joseph had written to his mother through a missionary contact, explaining his marriage and circumstances, they couldn't predict how the Shoshone band would receive a white woman in their midst. 2 weeks, perhaps, Eleanor estimated, studying the snow line on the distant peaks. "Are you ready?" The question encompassed far more than practical preparations. Joseph understood its deeper meaning, considering his answer with characteristic thoughtfulness. "I am ready to bring my wife to meet my family," he said finally. "Whether they are ready to meet her remains to be seen." Eleanor smiled at his candor. "Fair enough. And I suppose the same could be said about introducing you to my sister someday." The shared joke, gentle acknowledgement of the social complications their union created, reflected how far they had come. What had begun as an arrangement of necessity had evolved into a partnership of choice, fortified by mutual respect and growing affection. "Will you read her letter?" Joseph asked, gesturing to the envelope in Eleanor's pocket. "Later," she decided. "We should finish the south fence before midday." They worked side by side through the morning, Eleanor handling the lighter rails while Joseph set posts. The physical labor provided a comforting counterpoint to the uncertainties that lay ahead. Here, in the tangible work of building and growing, they found common ground that transcended their different origins. By noon, dark clouds had gathered over the western ridge, promising spring rain. They secured their tools and headed toward the cabin just as the first heavy drops began to fall. Inside, Eleanor stoked the fire, while Joseph prepared a simple meal of cornbread and stew from the previous day's rabbit. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof with hypnotic persistence. After they'd eaten, Eleanor finally withdrew her sister's letter, breaking the seal with careful fingers. Joseph busied himself cleaning his hunting knife, offering her privacy while remaining companionably present. As she unfolded the pages, something else fell out, a newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. Eleanor set it aside temporarily, focusing on Elizabeth's cramped handwriting. She read in silence, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern. Joseph noticed the change, but waited for her to speak. "Elizabeth writes that father has passed. Away," she said finally, "a month ago, pneumonia." "I am sorry," Joseph offered quietly. Eleanor nodded, acknowledging his sympathy while processing her own complicated feelings. "We were never close, especially after I chose to come west with William. But still, he was your father." Joseph completed the thought. "The connection remains, even when strained." "Yes." She continued reading, her brow furrowing. "There's more. Apparently he left me at the family home in Pennsylvania. Elizabeth is quite put out about it. She expected it would go to her husband's family since they've been caring for father these past years. Why would he leave it to you?" "I'm not sure," Eleanor admitted, scanning the rest of the letter. "Perhaps guilt for how we parted, or simply because I'm the eldest." She set the pages down, picking up the newspaper clipping. "She's included this as well. An advertisement for the sale of our property. She wants me to sign it over to her husband's family, as she feels they've earned it through their attentions to father. Joseph watched her carefully. What will you do? The question hung between them, weighted with implications neither had anticipated. The inheritance represented more than property. It was a potential escape route, a way back to respectable society, should their experiment in cross-cultural marriage prove too difficult. Eleanor studied the clipping, thoughts racing behind. Her composed features. Finally she looked up, meeting Joseph's steady gaze. "I need to think," she said honestly. "This changes things." He nodded, understanding without offense. "You should consider all paths." The rain continued throughout the afternoon, keeping them indoors with their separate reflections. Eleanor reread Elizabeth's letter several times, passing her sister's thinly veiled suggestions that this inheritance might provide Eleanor an opportunity to return to civilization and proper society, phrasing that made her bristle despite its predictability. Joseph maintained a respectful distance, occupying himself with mending harness leather and other indoor tasks. The space between them felt different than before, not tense exactly, but charged with unspoken possibilities. As dusk approached, the rain finally slackened. Joseph donned his coat, indicating he would check the livestock before full dark. Eleanor nodded, grateful for the moment alone to organize her thoughts. Standing at the window, she watched his familiar figure move across the yard toward the small barn. The sight stirred something profound within her. Appreciation for the man he had proven himself to be, beyond all prejudices and assumptions. Not just a wounded stranger she had saved from the snow, not merely a legal husband thrust upon her by circumstance, but a partner she had come to respect, admire, and yes, care for deeply. The Pennsylvania house represented security, respectability, a return to a world she had left behind. Yet as she contemplated this option, Eleanor realized that the world held little appeal compared to the life she and Joseph were building, challenging and uncertain as it might be. When he returned, shaking raindrops from his coat, she had reached her decision. "I won't be signing the house over to Elizabeth," she stated without preamble, "nor will I be returning east to claim it." Joseph hung his coat by the door, his expression revealing nothing. "You're certain?" "Yes." Eleanor moved to the hearth, adding another log to the fire. "That life is behind me now. Our future lies here, or wherever we choose to make it together." The simple declaration transformed the atmosphere between them. Joseph crossed to where she stood, close enough that she could feel the dampness still clinging to his shirt. "The warmth of his presence, Eleanor," he said softly, her name like a sacred word on his lips. For once he seemed to struggle for language. "I would not hold you to promises made under duress." "I know," she replied, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "That's precisely why I choose to honor them now, freely." Something shifted in his expression, the careful reserve giving way to naked emotion. Slowly, with deliberate tenderness, he reached for her hand. Eleanor met him halfway, their fingers intertwining with practiced ease. The moment might have deepened further, had fate not intervened in the form of pounding hooves approaching through the gathering darkness. They moved apart instinctively, Joseph reaching for the rifle while Eleanor peered through the window. Sarah, she identified their visitor with surprise, riding hard. They met her at the door as she dismounted, her expression grim beneath the hood of her rain-soaked cloak. "You need to leave," she said without greeting, her voice urgent. "Tonight, if possible." "What's happened?" Eleanor ushered her inside while Joseph secured the horse. Sarah pushed back her hood, water streaming from the edges. "Those drifters, Hollister and Reed, they've been drinking at the saloon all day, getting worked up. I overheard them talking with some of the miners from the South Ridge. They're planning to come out here tonight." "For what purpose?" Joseph asked. though his tone suggested he already knew. "Vigilante justice," Sarah confirmed grimly. "They're saying the judge was fooled by your half-breed tricks, that they're going to settle things properly." She grasped Eleanor's hands. "They mean to hang him, Eleanor, and anyone who stands in their way." The words landed like physical blows. Eleanor had known the settlement's acceptance was fragile, that the drifters harbored resentment over the judge's ruling, but she hadn't anticipated violence so direct, so immediate. "How many?" Joseph asked, practical even in crisis. "6, maybe 7, Sarah replied. "Hollister, Reed, 2 of the miners, and a few others I didn't recognize. They were gathering horses when I slipped out." Eleanor's mind raced with options. "We could ride for the settlement, appeal to Sheriff Daniels. Daniels is conveniently away at Fort Bridger," Sarah interrupted. "Won't be back for days. It's no coincidence they've chosen tonight." Joseph had already begun gathering essentials. Ammunition, food stores, warm clothing. His movements were efficient, unhurried despite the urgency. "We have perhaps an hour before they arrive," he estimated, glancing at the darkening sky. "Less if they ride hard." Eleanor joined him in preparations, fear transmuting into focused action. "The North Trail is likely muddy from the rain. They'll be slowed if they come that way. They'll split up," Joseph predicted, "circle the property to prevent escape." Sarah watched them with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Where will you go?" Joseph and Eleanor exchanged glances, silent. Communication passing between them. "West," he said finally, "to my people." The decisive statement settled over the cabin like a benediction, not a retreat or surrender, but a purposeful choice, the next step on a path they had already been, preparing to walk. "I'll delay them if I can," Sarah offered. "Say I saw you heading east toward Cheyenne." Eleanor embraced her friend fiercely. "You've risked enough for us already. Go home. Stay safe." Sarah returned the embrace, then stepped back with determination. "I'll be fine. They have no quarrel with me, but you need to hurry." Within 20 minutes, they had packed what they could carry on horseback. Essentials for the journey, irreplaceable mementos, tools for starting anew. Eleanor took a final look around the cabin that had been her home for 7 years. Her sanctuary after William's death, the crucible where her bond with Joseph had formed and strengthened. "We may never return," she acknowledged softly. Joseph stood beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. "Home is not walls and roof," he reminded her, echoing words spoken months earlier. "It is those with whom we share our days." The simple wisdom fortified her resolve. With a last grateful embrace for Sarah, they mounted their horses, Eleanor on her faithful mare, Joseph on a sturdy gelding they had purchased from Thomas Reynolds after the court hearing. "The western pass," Joseph directed, pointing toward the mountains now silhouetted against the night sky. "We'll have better cover through the pine forest." They rode at a steady pace, not rushing the horses over terrain made treacherous by spring. Mud, but maintaining urgency. The rain had stopped, but clouds still obscured the moon, providing welcome darkness for their flight. An hour into their journey, Joseph suddenly raised his hand, signaling halt. Eleanor reined in beside him, straining to hear what had caught his attention. Then she heard it too. Distant shouts, the angry voices of men carried on the night air. "They've reached the cabin," Joseph surmised, his expression grim in the darkness. "Found it empty." "Will they follow?" Eleanor asked, though she already knew the answer. "Yes, but not easily. The rain has washed away clear tracks." They continued, westward, climbing steadily toward the mountain pass. The terrain grew more challenging, narrow trails winding through pine forest, creek beds swollen with snowmelt, rocky outcroppings that loomed like sentinels in the darkness. Yet Joseph navigated with confidence, drawing on knowledge passed through generations of his people who had traveled these mountains since time immemorial. Near midnight, they paused to rest the horses at a sheltered hollow beside a stream. The Night had cleared somewhat, allowing glimpses of stars between drifting clouds. Eleanor dismounted stiffly, her body unaccustomed to such sustained riding. "Are you well?" Joseph asked, helping her down. "Well enough," she assured him, though exhaustion pulled at her limbs. "How much farther to your people's camp?" 2 days' ride, if the weather holds," he replied, watering the horses. "We'll reach the high ridge by dawn. From there, we can see." "Anyone following?" Eleanor nodded, trust in his judgment overriding her fatigue. As they prepared to continue, distant sounds drifted up from the valley below, the unmistakable echo of men calling to one another, the occasional flash of torchlight among the trees. "They're persistent," she observed, a chill running through her that had nothing to do with the night air. "They hunt what they fear," Joseph said simply. "It gives them purpose, belonging." The insight struck Eleanor as profoundly sad, that men would unite in hatred more readily than understanding, find identity in destroying what challenged their narrow worldview rather than expanding it. By dawn, they had reached the promised ridge, a rocky spine that offered views of the valley they had fled and the wilderness that awaited. In the clear morning light, Eleanor could see no signs of pursuit, though smoke rose from what must be their cabin in the far distance. The sight sent a pang through her heart, not just for the physical loss, but for the dream of acceptance it had represented. Joseph stood beside her, reading her thoughts in her expression. "They cannot take what matters most," he said, his hand finding hers. "Our path, our choice, our future." The simple words carried Eleanor beyond grief into resolve. Turning away from the valley, she faced west with him, toward mountains bathed in golden morning light, toward unknown challenges and possibilities, toward the people who might become a new kind of family if given the chance. "Tell me about them," she requested as they mounted their journey. "Your mother, your relatives, what should I know before we arrive?" Joseph smiled, a full, unguarded expression that transformed his features. "My mother is called Singing Bird. She is wise, strong-willed. She will question you directly, holding nothing back. Answer with equal honesty, and you will earn her respect." As they rode, he shared more about Shoshone customs, beliefs, daily practices, knowledge Eleanor absorbed eagerly, preparing herself for the new world they approached. In turn, she told him about her childhood in Pennsylvania, the education she might offer to children in his band, the skills she could contribute beyond her knowledge of farming. They were building bridges before they arrived, constructing a shared vision of possibility that might, with care and persistence, become reality. Their journey continued through that day and the next, the landscape changing around them as they climbed higher, then descended into valleys unknown to most white settlers. Game was plentiful, water pure and cold from mountain springs. Joseph moved through this terrain with innate confidence, while Eleanor observed everything with fresh eyes, learning the land's rhythms and secrets. On the afternoon of the third day, Joseph halted suddenly, his posture alert. Eleanor followed his gaze to a distant ridge where 3 mounted figures had appeared, watching them. "Shoshone scouts," he explained, a mixture of emotions crossing his features. "They've been tracking us since morning." "What happens now?" Eleanor asked, nervousness and anticipation mingling in her stomach. Joseph raised his arm in greeting. After a moment, one of the distant riders returned the gesture, then all 3 disappeared back over the ridge. "Now," he said, turning to Eleanor with quiet certainty, "we continue forward, together." As they resumed their journey, Eleanor felt a curious sense of completion, not an ending, but the closing of one circle and the beginning of another. The forced marriage that had begun as an act of dominance and control had transformed through their own choices into something neither the settlement nor Joseph's people might fully understand, but which had power and validity nonetheless. They rode side by side toward the future they had chosen, their shared path illuminated by the setting sun, a widow and a warrior no longer defined by loss or conflict, but by the life they were creating together between worlds. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.